Hey there, welcome to Sleepy Granny Stories. Settle in, dear listener, and let your breathing slow. Tonight's story comes from a place where wildflowers grow along garden walls, where the world feels both vast and intimate, and where a small sparrow once learned that the size of your wings need not determine the size of your life. Close your eyes if you wish, and let us wander together into this gentle tale. There was a garden wall made of old stone, weathered smooth by decades of rain and sun, and upon this wall lived a sparrow named Della. Her feathers were the colour of wheat fields in autumn, soft browns and gentle golds, and she had made her nest in a crevice where two stones didn't quite meet. It was a perfect nest, lined with dandelion fluff and bits of moss, tucked away from the wind. Each morning, Della would wake to the amber glow of sunrise filtering through the ivy that draped across her wall. She would hop along the stones, her tiny feet making no sound at all, and she would sing. Her song was not elaborate or long, but it was hers, a simple melody that seemed to say, "I am here, I am awake, I am alive." Below her wall stretched a garden full of lavender and rosemary, where butterflies danced lazy spirals in the afternoon heat. Beyond the garden lay a meadow, and beyond the meadow hills rolled toward a horizon Della had never felt the need to explore. Life was small and complete, like a pearl held in a closed hand. One evening in late summer, when the sky blushed pink and orange, Della heard a sound she had never heard before, a sound like wind given voice, like distant thunder made of wings. She looked up and saw them, a flock of geese flying in perfect formation, their bodies dark against the coloured sky, their calls echoing across the meadow. They landed near the pond at the meadow's edge, and Della watched from her wall, curious. The next morning she flew down to the pond's rim, keeping a respectful distance. The geese were enormous compared to her, their necks long and elegant, their wings powerful enough to carry them across entire continents. One of the geese, an older bird with wise eyes, noticed Della perched on a reed. "Good morning, little sister," the goose said, her voice warm despite its depth. Della chirped a greeting, suddenly aware of how small her voice sounded. The geese spoke among themselves of their journey, of mountain ranges where the air grew thin and cold, of coastlines where the ocean stretched beyond sight, of cities that glittered like fallen stars at night. They spoke of storms they had flown through, of winds that had tested their strength, of the magnetic pull that guided them thousands of miles to places Della couldn't imagine. That night, Della returned to her nest, but sleep came slowly. She kept thinking of those distant shores, those mountain peaks, those glittering cities. She thought of the geese's powerful wings and their purposeful journey, and when she looked at her own small wings, they seemed inadequate somehow, as though they had shrunk while she wasn't looking. In the days that followed, more travellers passed through the meadow. Swallows arrived, speaking breathlessly of their journey from Africa, of deserts crossed and seas navigated by starlight. A heron stopped by the pond, mentioning casually the wetlands she had seen, the rivers she had followed, the abundance of fish in waters far from here. Della listened to every story, and with each one, Her garden wall seemed to shrink. The lavender and rosemary below seemed less colourful. Her simple morning song felt thin and meaningless compared to the grand adventures being described all around her. She began to wake earlier, practicing flying in wider and wider circles. She pushed herself higher into the sky, her small heart beating fast with effort. She studied the travellers, trying to understand what made them different, what gave them the strength to leave everything behind and embrace the vast unknown. One cool morning, when autumn had just begun to paint the leaves with fire, Della made her decision. She would join the next flock heading south. She would prove that she too could fly far, could see distant lands, could live a life of grand adventure rather than small routines. A group of starlings arrived that afternoon, their feathers iridescent in the slanting light, already discussing their departure the following dawn. "May I join you?" Della asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The starlings looked at each other, then at Della. "The journey is long," one said, not unkindly. "We fly for days without stopping, riding high winds, pushing through exhaustion." "I can do it," Della insisted. "I've been practicing." The lead starling tilted her head, studying Della with eyes that had seen many seasons. "Very well," she said finally. "Meet us at the oak tree before sunrise. We leave when the first light touches the horizon." Della barely slept that night. She kept her eyes on the stars through the gap in her nest, watching them wheel slowly across the sky, marking the passage of time. When the darkness finally began to thin at the edges, she emerged and flew to the oak tree. The starlings were already there, hundreds of them, moving as one organism, their wings creating a sound like whispered conversations in a vast hall. And then they were off. Della launched herself into the air, her wings beating frantically to keep pace. At first it was exhilarating, the rush of wind, the sense of purpose, the earth falling away beneath her. She was doing it. She was really doing it. But as the sun rose higher and the hours passed, Della began to understand the difference between practicing and enduring. Her wings, so perfect for short flights between garden and meadow, began to ache. The muscles along her chest burned. Her breath came in desperate gasps. The starlings moved with effortless efficiency, their bodies designed for this exact purpose, their movements synchronized through instinct and ancient memory. Della struggled to keep up, falling farther and farther behind the main flock. By midday, clouds had gathered, dark towers of grey that turned the air heavy and electric. The starlings flew faster, trying to outrun the weather, but the storm overtook them. Rain came in sheets, cold and blinding. Wind buffeted Della from all directions, tossing her small body like a leaf. She could no longer see the starlings ahead. She could barely see at all. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook her tiny bones. She tried to remember why she had wanted this, tried to summon the determination that had felt so clear and strong in her garden. But all she could feel now was terror and a bone-deep exhaustion that made her wings feel like lead. She was going to fall. She was going to fall from the sky and never return to her nest. Never again hear her own morning song. Never again smell the lavender below her wall. Through the rain, Della spotted a dark shape. A barn, its doors open just enough to offer refuge. Using the last of her strength, she angled toward it and tumbled through the opening, landing in a heap on the dry floor inside. She lay there for a long time, sides heaving, wings splayed, rain drumming on the roof above. Gradually, her breathing slowed. She tucked herself into a corner where old hay had gathered and fell into an exhausted sleep. She woke to silence. The storm had passed. Through the barn's gaps, she could see stars, the same stars she used to watch from her garden wall, though they looked different from here, less familiar, colder somehow. An owl sat in the rafters above, his large eyes luminous in the darkness. "Lost your way?" the owl asked, his voice like rustling leaves. "I was trying to fly south," Della said quietly, "with the starlings, but I couldn't keep up." The owl was silent for a moment, considering. "The starlings are born to that journey," he said finally. "Their bodies, their instincts, their very purpose is shaped around those migrations. They do not choose it. It chooses them." "But I wanted to see what they see," Della said. "To live a bigger life." "Bigger," the owl repeated. "Tell me, little sparrow, what is bigger, the ocean or the single drop of dew that contains an entire world when the morning light hits it just right?" When dawn came, Della left the barn. But instead of trying to catch up with the starlings, instead of pushing herself toward some distant horizon, she turned back. The flight home took 3 days. She rested often, found food in hedgerows, slept in safe hollows, and as she flew, something shifted inside her. The landscape she passed over was the same she had flown through in the other direction, but now she saw it differently. She noticed things she had missed in her desperate race to keep up. A creek that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds, a field of wildflowers moving in waves beneath the wind, a family of rabbits playing at the edge of a wood. She saw other sparrows too, living their small lives with quiet contentment, and instead of seeing limitation, she began to see choice. Scene 9. the garden wall again. When Della finally saw her garden wall rising in the distance, she felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. She landed on her familiar stone, and everything was exactly as she had left it. The lavender and rosemary still grew below. The ivy still draped across the wall. Her nest was still tucked in its crevice, waiting. But Della herself was different. She spent that first evening simply sitting on her wall, watching the sun set over the meadow, seeing it with new eyes. The colours seemed richer now, the peace more profound. This was not a small life, it was a complete one. The next morning, Della woke with the sunrise, as she always had. She hopped along the stones, her tiny feet making no sound at all, and she sang. But her song had changed. It was still simple, still brief, but now it carried a depth it hadn't before. A knowing, a gratitude, a recognition of choice over circumstance. A young sparrow from a neighbouring wall heard her song and flew over, landing beside her. "That's beautiful," the young sparrow said shyly. "Have you always sung like that?" Della considered the question. "No," she said. "I had to leave to learn how to stay." The young sparrow looked confused, so Della tried again. "I had to try living someone else's life to appreciate my own." As autumn deepened and then gave way to winter, Della watched the migrants pass through again, geese flying north, their journeys never ending, their lives lived in motion. She watched them with admiration now, but without envy. One evening, a single starling landed on her wall, exhausted from the journey back. Della recognized her as one of the flock she had tried to join. "You didn't make it south," the starling observed. "No," Della agreed. "I discovered I didn't need to." The starling preened her feathers, considering this. "Most birds couldn't understand that," she said. "They'd see staying as failing." "And I used to see leaving as succeeding," Della replied. "But maybe success is just knowing which sky you're meant for." Winter came, and the garden transformed. The lavender and rosemary went dormant. Snow covered the meadow in white silence. The migrants were all gone, following the sun to warmer lands. But Della remained, and she was not alone. Other sparrows stayed too, and together they found seeds in the frozen garden, shared warmth on the coldest nights, told stories in the blue twilight. Della discovered a different kind of beauty in staying. The beauty of knowing every stone in her wall, every plant in her garden, every shift in the wind. She learned the names of winter stars. She watched ice form intricate patterns on the pond. She saw the exact moment when the light began returning, the days imperceptibly lengthening towards spring. This knowledge, this intimacy with one place, was its own kind of journey, just measured in depth rather than distance. When spring finally arrived, painting the world green again, The migrants returned. The geese landed by the pond. The swallows swept through the air. The starlings gathered in the oak tree. And this time, when they spoke of their journeys, Della listened with genuine interest rather than comparison. She asked questions, marveled at their stories, celebrated their incredible feats. But when they departed again, she remained on her wall with a peaceful heart. A butterfly landed beside her one warm afternoon, its wings the colour of sunlight through honey. "Do you ever wonder about the places they go?" the butterfly asked, watching a flock disappear into the distance. "Sometimes," Della admitted. "But mostly I wonder about the places they never stay long enough to truly know. Every choice is also a sacrifice. They trade depth for breadth, and that's wonderful for them. But I've learned I prefer my kind of wonder." Years passed. Della grew older, her feathers dulling slightly, her flights a bit less energetic, but no less purposeful. Young sparrows came and went, some staying, some leaving to test themselves against larger skies. And Della became something unexpected, not a traveller with tales of distant lands, but a keeper of place, someone who knew the deep stories that only emerge when you stay somewhere long enough to understand its rhythms. She knew which flowers bloomed first in spring, and which held on longest in fall. She knew where to find food in the harshest winter, where to shelter in the fiercest storm. She knew the fox's territory and the hawk's hunting hours. She knew the garden wall's warm spots and cool spots, its secret crevices and sun-soaked stones. And in knowing these things intimately, she had travelled further than many who had crossed continents. She had travelled inward, and she had arrived at a place very few ever find. Home, chosen rather than settled for, embraced rather than merely inhabited. One spring evening, as Della sat on her wall, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, a young sparrow landed beside her, restless, eager, full of questions about the world beyond the meadow. "Don't you ever feel like you've wasted your life staying here?" the young bird asked, echoing the very thoughts Della had once tortured herself with. Della looked at the young sparrow with kind eyes, seeing herself in that restless energy. "I used to think that," she said gently. "I used to measure my life against others and find it wanting. But then I learned something important. Not every sky needs to be crossed to be understood. Not every life needs to be large to be complete." The young sparrow looked skeptical, as young birds often do. So Della continued. "The geese must fly because their hearts call them to distance. The swallows must migrate because their bodies are built for it. And I must stay because this wall, this garden, this small corner of the world has chosen me as much as I've chosen it. We are not all meant for the same sky." The young bird sat quietly, absorbing this. "But how do you know which sky is yours?" they asked finally. Della smiled. "You listen, not to the stories of others, not to what you think you should want, but to the quiet voice inside that tells you where you belong. And then you have the courage to honor that voice, even if it leads you to a smaller sky than others fly in, because a small sky fully explored is infinitely larger than a vast sky merely passed through. The sun touched the horizon, and Della's evening song rose into the gentle air, simple, brief, and perfectly complete. And so, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep, remember this: your life is not diminished by choosing depth over distance, by staying when others go, by finding contentment in what is, rather than yearning endlessly for what might be. You are meant for your own sky, whatever size it may be, and in that sky, lived fully and embraced completely, you will find all the wonder and meaning you could ever need. Sleep well, knowing you are exactly where you need to be. Good night.